Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I rise to speak to the committee status of the Immigration Amendment Bill No. 2, and I just want to clarify that the Minister's characterisation of the Labor Party's, the reasons for the Labor Party's opposition to this bill are not in fact correct. Of course, it goes so much deeper than the issues that he was talking to. I think really the government's response to this, because this is the part of this bill that really resonates with the Labor Party, is the attempt to resolve exploitation of migrant workers in New Zealand workplaces. That's an incredibly important issue because it is part of the Labor Party's determination to build decent work and decent jobs back in this country after it's been decimated by the government opposite. Part of doing that is ensuring that migrant workers are not being used to undermine and undercut New Zealand workers, and that they are in fact not being exploited themselves. So if this bill satisfactorily came up with the right solution that addressed that issue, of course the Labor Party would be supporting it. But in fact what it is a bit of window dressing. It purports to fix the problem, but just like they found up in Northland, that once again the National Party has come up with the wrong answer. They've come up to the wrong answer to the problem. And I just want to enlarge on this, Mr Chair, because the Minister's explanation for why was it immigration officers that had extended powers when it came to the exploitation of migrant workers, his explanation was that this is an immigration amendment bill. Well, I'm sorry, Mr Minister, but that is not a good enough reason for getting this so badly wrong. Because the fact is, if anyone understands the power relationships in any workplace, let alone the power relationships for migrant workers who also have the additional, power relationship of dealing with immigration and being here at the behest of a decision made by the Immigration Department, then anyone would understand why workers who are being exploited are not going to feel comfortable reporting that exploitation to the Immigration Department. It is the rightful place of addressing exploitation of workers' issues in New Zealand for that to be reported to the Department of Labour, the Department of Labour Minister. And it is not an acceptable excuse to say that the reason why migrant workers, if they believe they are being exploited, have to report this to the Immigration Department is simply because the Minister decided to bring this forward as an immigration bill. The Minister, in fact, happens to be the same person who is the Minister of Labour, who should have been bringing this forward as a bill under that category, because there's the Department of Labour that has the speciality in dealing with exploitation of workers in New Zealand workplaces. It is the Department of Labour that I believe, that the Labor Party believes migrant workers would feel more comfortable in reporting exploitation of themselves to, because they do not have a power relationship with the Ministry of Labour or MOBI, as it's hidden in that monstrous ministry these days, as they do with the Immigration Department, who has the ability to deport, who has the ability to look into a range of issues about their status as migrant workers, and therefore is not the appropriate body for worker exploitation to be reported to. Can't help but thinking that, again, this is the government recognising its own failure to actually resource the Ministry of Labour and the Labour Inspectorate properly. They know that they do not have anywhere near the number of labour inspectors they need to deal with the issues of worker exploitation in the New Zealand workplace, let alone deal with the issues and the complexity of issues that are brought about when migrant workers are exploited in the workplace. Mr Chair, this would seem like an awful lot more genuine attempt by the government to deal with worker exploitation, exploitation of particularly migrant workers, if this wasn't the same government that is currently suspended the work testing rule in Queenstown. Why I raise that in this debate is that this is a way, suspending that work test where employers have to prove, Mr Chair, have to prove that they have in the first instance tried to recruit, Mr Chair,
Sue Moroney,
where they have tried to recruit New Zealand workers first and foremost into roles in the hospitality sector in Queenstown. So these are not very high-paying jobs. These are cleaning jobs. These are hospitality jobs in the main. That this government has now, in the first time that I know of in New Zealand's history, they have suspended that very important market testing requirement where they are required to make sure that New Zealand workers have been approached first. I raise it in the context of this debate because this is one of the main ways that we can ensure that migrant workers are not being used to undermine New Zealand workers by being exploited in their workplace. Now, we know that in the case of Queenstown, that it is very high accommodation costs. Anyone who's been to Queenstown will know that it's not a cheap place to live in at all. Not a cheap place to buy your groceries in, not a cheap place to rent in. The costs are probably amongst the highest in any location that you go to in New Zealand. And yet it may be exactly there where, because of the suspension, the temporary suspension of that work test, of that market test, by the government, that we may find that the exploitation will be at its highest. And I say that because actually if employers, as they often argue, wanted market rules to apply in setting wages, then in Queenstown they would be prepared to pay higher wages to get New Zealanders to actually be able to afford to live in Queenstown and be able to undertake those jobs. It is of concern that the government, at the same time as putting this legislation through, is making it easier. Well, in fact, saying to Queenstown employers, you don't actually need to even bother trying to recruit New Zealand workers into those jobs. It's a free-for-all. Get the backpackers to come in and do that job, and that's all fine as far as that government is concerned. So therefore, on this bill, I believe that it is simply window dressing. The government has no real intention to address issues of migrant exploitation. If they did, they would have been bringing forward a bill that actually lifted the number of labour inspectors through the country. They would have been bringing forward a bill that made sure that it was the Department of Labour where migrant workers were reporting exploitation to, rather than the Immigration Department, for the reasons that I have already outlined. Mr Chair, while I am taking a call on this bill, I'm not satisfied with the Minister's answer about our questions, and I think very legitimate questions, about wanting to make sure that the levy being imposed in this bill on migrant workers when they make their applications is not simply a way of the government properly funding the Immigration Advisers Authority, because it's become clear to the Labour Party that the Immigration Advisers Authority, which in fact was initially, the legislation was set up under the previous Labour government, but it was implemented by an incoming national government. And it's clear that the amount of funding, government funding, put towards establishing an authority has not been adequate to make it work properly. And therefore, we are concerned that this migrant levy is being used to prop that up. And I'm not satisfied by the answer from the Minister, where he says a levy is not a tax because it has to be used for a certain purpose. Well, at the moment, we've got this government using ACC levies to prop up the Crown's accounts, to return them to surplus. Well, we absolutely do, Mr Bailey, by the government's own admission. By the government's own admission, ACC levies are being used to return the Crown's accounts to surplus.